So, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mike Garvin. I'm a professor at Virginia Tech, and I'm one of the regional directors for the Build America Center, and I help coordinate this modernizing web infrastructure webinar series, where we bring various topics for folks to present upon. And today we're very pleased to have with us Christian Gable and Thomas Tibergian from Rebel. And they're going to talk to us about state infrastructure banks and the role that they can play in the financing of transportation improvements. I would ask that if you have questions during the presentation, please post those into the chat. I will monitor the chat, and then we'll address those questions at the conclusion of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christian and Thomas.
Thanks, Mike. I really appreciate your introduction, and to all those who are in attendance today, thank you so much for participating. And thank you to the Build America Center. As probably many of you know, the Build America Center is a great resource for knowledge on funding and financing in the infrastructure sector. So we are happy to be sharing with you today a little bit of knowledge on state infrastructure banks specifically. I think our agenda today is, fairly simple. We want to talk to you a little bit about our research, as well as kind of contextualize state infrastructure banks for those who might not be very familiar with them. If you are quite familiar with them, bear with us. We'll try to move on and get to kind of the learnings of our work. We'll talk a bit about the kind of federal foundations and the relationship with SIBs, from how they were institutionalized and the kind of chronology of their development. And then we'll get into kind of what we learned through our research on what practitioners are facing as far as challenges today, and what we are seeing as kind of key for leading into a strong SIBs and how they contribute to the sector and their potential for growing the sector. One caveat as we get into the work: a lot of what we're presenting to you today is based on a research report we did for the Build America Center called the Status of State Infrastructure Banks. And you can find it on the Build America Center's website. And the goal of that research was really a deep dive into the practitioner environment of SIBs across the country, how the federally backed accounts and SIBs, which my colleague Thomas will speak a little bit more about later, how those accounts are utilized, or how they're being leveraged, and the factors that kind of shape program performance. So that was a bit inside baseball as far as SIB operations, but we've tried to translate that to make it relevant to you today, and give you some topical input on what SIB administrators are working with, and how it might be relevant for your own personal efforts. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Christian. So let's start by defining what state infrastructure banks, or SIBs, actually are. So at their core, SIBs are state-run revolving loan funds. They provide low-cost, flexible financing for transportation and related infrastructure, so things like highways, bridges, rail, and transit improvements. What makes them different from a grant program is that SIBs recycle these loan repayments. So when a borrower repays a loan, that money goes right back into the fund and can be relent for new projects. This makes SIBs different and a sustainable source of financing, so it continues to grow its impact over time. In that sense, it's a tool that's both financial and strategic, right? Because it keeps public dollars working on public infrastructure. SIBs can offer a few different kinds of support, though mainly loans, but the goal is always to fill funding gaps that other sources don't cover. They're designed to complement grants, bonds, or federal programs, not replace them in any way. So, for example, a city might use a grant for most of a project and then take a SIB loan to cover a shortfall or accelerate delivery. In terms of what they do, SIBs are all about flexibility and access. We'll talk little bit more about this later, but they help accelerate project delivery by providing ready capital when projects are stuck waiting for funds. They smooth out cash flows as well, which is useful for smaller agencies managing multiple projects. And they're often one of the few financing tools available for rural or smaller jurisdictions that don't have easy access to bond markets, for example. Finally, a quick word on the legal foundation. So the SIB program started as a federal pilot in 1995 under the NHS Designation Act and was really codified under the T21 Act in 1998 as part of the Title 23 code, Section 610. And so what we're going to be focusing on a lot is these federally capitalized SIBs. So meaning those that received federal funds under these legislations. And they must follow the federal requirements under Title 23 and Title 49, such as NEPA, Davis-Bacon, and Buy America. But every SIB also exists under state enabling legislation, which defines how it's governed, what kinds of project it can fund, how flexible it can be, et cetera, et cetera. Some states even only use state funds and operate completely under state law. Others use a hybrid model where they blend state and federal accounts, and just a few use just federal accounts. So in short, every state looks a little different, but they all serve that same goal to help deliver transportation projects faster, smarter, and more sustainably. So let's take a look at these different types of SIBs. So it's helpful to understand these different structures. So broadly speaking, there's a key difference between where their initial funding comes from, whether it's state money, federal money, or a mix of both. So let's start with the state-only SIBs. These SIBs are entirely capitalized with state funds and operate solely under state law without any direct federal involvement. Because they don't use federal money, they're not subject to federal compliance requirements, and this makes them a little bit more adapted to that state's environment. And as a result, they tend to be very nimble in issuing loans and structuring terms. Some even issue grants. They kind of just have their own operation process. Examples include programs like Virginia's VTIB, Georgia's GTIB, California's iBank, and we'll talk about GTIB when we look at a case study. And then we have the federally capitalized SIBs, which take two main forms. So as we talked about, so the hybrid SIBs, which have federal and state accounts, and the federal only SIBs, which only have federal accounts. And this was really the focus of our research. So hybrid SIBs combine those two state accounts, which gives them flexibility. Because that state account, as we said, doesn't have those federal constraints. The federal accounts, meanwhile, let them deploy federal funds for projects that already meet Title 23 and Title 49 eligibility. And this allows them to support a wider set of infrastructure needs. Many of the most active programs, such as Florida's and Ohio's SIBs, follow this hybrid model. Federal-only SIBs, on the other hand, would operate exclusively with the federal accounts, and the best known example is Texas. Our research for this project, again, focused on these federally capitalized SIBs, so a lot of the data that we're going to show you is based off of this. Though in the symposium that we attended in May, we also discussed with a lot of these state-only SIBs. So we'll be bringing in a little bit of that insight into this presentation as well. All right, so now that we understand the types of SIBs, let's talk about how they're capitalized. So SIBs are initially funded through a mix of federal and state dollars. So under the Title 23, Section 610, states can set aside up to 10% of their annual federal aid highway and transit funds to capitalize their SIBs. But that federal contribution must be paired with a minimum 25% state match. So that combined pool of funds creates that initial federal account inside a SIB, right? The state accounts are handled just by states. And so this structure makes SIBs a true state-federal partnership. So federal seed capital matched with state investment and managed at the state level. Once those accounts are capitalized, SIBs can start lending, but within certain boundaries for their federal elite capitalized accounts. Again, those projects are only the ones that are eligible under Title 23, which is highways, and Title 29, which is transit and rail of the US Code. And because these accounts use federal money, they have to follow all applicable federal requirements. Again, things like NEPA, Davis-Bacon, and Buy America. As we said before, the other thing that makes SIBs kind of unique is that they revolve, right? So there's that fund keeps coming back to that money keeps coming back to the fund as principal and interest repayments. But there's been a key change since the program's early days. So under the original 1995 pilot program, the repaid funds essentially became state dollars. So once that money came back to the bank, states could use it a little bit more flexibly, even for non-federal programs. Under later legislation, so specifically the Transportation Equity Act for the 21st century in 1998, that changed. So under today's rules, repaid funds retain that federal character, meaning that even recycled dollars are still subject to the same Title 23 and Title 49 requirements. So this shift narrowed a little bit how SIBs use their federal funds, but reinforced federal oversight and accountability. This is a trade-off that still shapes how SIBs operate today. So now that we've seen how SIBs are structured and capitalized, let's take a closer look at what federally backed SIBs accounts actually mean in practice and why they remain important today and relevant. So when SIBs were first introduced nearly 30 years ago, they represented a new and creative approach to infrastructure financing, which allowed states to leverage federal funds more effectively by converting those one-time federal dollars into a revolving low-cost loan program. And that model worked. SIBs operating today, many of the SIBs operating today were seeded with this federal capitalization, and those early funds continue to revolve across states. So as of fiscal year 25, federally capitalized SIBs have received about $600 million in federal funds, which were matched with roughly $200 million in state funds, and those dollars continue to support new loans. What's interesting is how far those dollars have gone over time. So according to FHWA data, again, federally backed SIBs have collectively made more than 800 loans since the program's inception, and that has totaled about $3.3 billion in financing with, an average loan size of 4 million. These loans have supported projects in states across the US, and from small rural road improvements to large bridge investments, for example. And over time, SIBs have become more structured, professionalized programs. In other words, they've evolved from this novel, innovative pilot program to a more mature and established financing tool, sorry. Beyond the numbers, what's really valuable today is kind of the network of practitioners behind these programs. There's now an established community of state and federal practitioners who continue to refine and improve how these programs operate. That's why we're here today, right? To help encourage more overview and more accessibility to SIBs. And additionally, many of the most active states, so we've mentioned Florida, Texas, and Ohio already, they have decades of experience running their SIBs, and they can share their knowledge with other SIBs and with the FHWA and with the Build America Center. So now I kind of want to talk about the differences across SIBs. So one of the things that's most, I guess, surprising is just how different they are from one state to another. So we talked about the different kind of capitalization approaches, but also the size is a very important factor. And this chart illustrates that wide range. So some of the smallest SIBs were capitalized with $1.5 million in federal money, and then the largest was capitalized with $171 million. So it's important. It is important to keep in mind that these figures just reflect federal capitalization. So this doesn't include the state money allocated to these SIBs, but it still shows that there's an unevenness. That means that there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach to improving or managing SIBs. A SIB with $1.5 million simply can't operate at the same scale or with the same staffing or marketing capacity as a SIB with hundreds of millions in capital. So a larger better capitalized program, again, like those in Texas, Florida, and Ohio, tend to be the most active simply because they have the most resources, more dedicated staff, and that results in a consistent project pipeline. But smaller SIBs still can have an impact. They just tend to serve smaller, more targeted local projects, often in rural areas. And that difference in scale also shows up when we look at how active these programs are, which we'll see on the next slide. So this slide gives us a snapshot of what's happening based on the latest available FHWA data of federally capitalized SIB accounts. And it shows that there's still meaningful activity across a range of states. In fiscal year 23, so 6 SIBs issued new loans from their federal accounts: Nebraska, Ohio, Oregon, Tennessee, Texas, and Utah. Together, these 6 programs closed 24 new loans, totaling nearly $70 million in federally backed financing. And the 2 biggest players in this case, Texas and Ohio, accounted for the majority of that activity, together representing about 85% of all new federal account lending that year. But this chart only tells part of the story, right? So as we've said before, many of the most active SIBs, which aren't in this, so like Florida and Michigan as well, also manage state accounts alongside the federal ones. And these hybrid SIBs often move more loans and more money through their state accounts, but that's not reflected here because they're not federally capitalized. So while federal accounts represent one important part of the SIB ecosystem, there's a lot more happening outside these numbers through that state level lending and refinancing. And in addition to these new loans, there's more than 200 active loans from previous years, which remain in repayment across 15 states. And those represent about $660 million still circulating through those federal accounts. So I think the takeaway here is that federal SIB accounts remain active and relevant. And then when you include the parallel activity happening through state accounts, the picture becomes much broader and more dynamic than what's captured in the single data set. So now I'll move on to showcasing some of the case studies I referred to that we found interesting. So first is this project in the village of, I can't pronounce this, I'm not going to try, Gnadenhutten in Ohio. And I think this is a great example of the kind of typical work that SIBs regularly support, and why these tools matter for smaller, often rural communities. So this is a small village of just over 1,200 people, and the project itself is pretty straightforward, right? So sidewalk improvements, curb ramps, pedestrian lighting, drainage repair. It's nothing crazy. And then the loan amount itself is not that crazy. It's $616,000. And this is in that typical range of SIBs nationwide. I think this is around what I would say is the median loan amount, maybe a little bit lower. And here it's paired with TAP funding. The repayment for the loan comes from local tax receipts, so sales tax, license tax, gas tax, and this is also very familiar, a very familiar structure for SIBs. These aren't really complicated financial instruments, and they're designed to be accessible. So what makes this project interesting isn't really the scale or the complexity, it's just how typical it is. This could be any small town or any village anywhere in the US, and the same kind of success drivers that SIBs have can be applied to there as well. That being said, it's not, these projects are happening all the time, but many communities don't know that SIBs are an option. So one of the biggest challenges that we've heard in interviews is that rural and smaller jurisdictions often aren't aware that this type of financing exists, or they don't have the staff capacity to pursue it. Later in the presentation, we'll return to this when we talk about marketing and outreach. But because helping communities even know that SIBs exist is still a major barrier to their use. So while the structure here is textbook, getting this loan to the finish line likely required that kind of awareness, capacity, and some degree of hand-holding, all of which highlight how important program visibility is, which is why we're here as well, right? All of us. Yeah, and so being able to direct SIB money toward more projects like this is important, and it's something that we want to encourage through the Build America Center's efforts and everything. So let's move on to the next project. So there is a little caveat. So this is a project by a state-backed SIB. So they don't have any federal accounts. But what they did here is that they quantified their impact, which is why I use this example. But this is something that we see throughout. So this is a project from Pike County, Georgia. And it's a strong example of how SIB-style lending can accelerate delivery and reduce costs, while also serving as a powerful marketing tool. So Pike County received a $5 million loan and a $1 million grant from the Georgia Transportation Infrastructure Bank to resurface 17 roads. Thanks to GTIB funding, they were able to start construction 6 years earlier than they would have with traditional funding sources. And so GTIB estimated that this early delivery could save the county, has saved the county between $500,000 and $2 million by avoiding inflation-driven cost escalation and, yeah, mostly inflation-driven cost escalation. And this is a compelling number to local decision makers. But it's also a story that demonstrates something that we've heard repeatedly from SIBs around the country, this kind of flexibility and this accelerated delivery. SIBs can tailor loan timing and terms, meaning that they can get the money out the door faster than other like grant programs or bond processes. And that flexibility leads to projects breaking ground sooner and getting done faster, which then translates into cost savings, uh, even if they're not always quantified like they were here. And then the kind of additional thing that GTIP did is that they didn't just stop at this project. They turned this into a success story that then they used to market and in their outreach materials to to attract new applicants. And that strategy really worked. So they saw a notable uptick in applications the following year because of this marketing. So it's a great example as well of how documenting and communicating success can help grow that program's visibility and pipeline. So while this example does come up from a state-funded bank rather than a federally capitalized SIB, it still reflects themes that cut across the SIB ecosystem, namely flexibility and responsiveness are key advantages. And then the final case study I wanted to present is this example from the Florida SIB. And unlike the two other examples, it's not really a single project. It's a case of how Florida SIB as a program leveraged a creative capitalization strategy to support many programs in the future. So in 2023, Florida identified an opportunity to combine toll credits with its August redistribution allocation to capitalize a new federal SIB account. And this
This
wasn't a
wasn't a
matter
matter
of needing to find a match. It was really about not having to spend time and resources identifying new state funds, which often isn't a priority for many states. So by using toll credits as a soft match, Florida was able to unlock $40 million in federal funds without committing any new state dollars. And this is a move that gave them flexibility to support future loans. So Florida essentially parked that money in the SIB rather than losing access to it and created a revolving loan pool that will support future projects as needs arise. And further than just this process, Florida then also just engaged with the Build America Center and the FHWA to develop guidance, the guidance memo that encourages this kind of approach for other states. And so this is a case that shows how a well-resourced and proactive SIB program can develop new processes and capitalize their fund in creative ways. So large experience programs like Florida's have the capacity and foresight to pursue these creative financial strategies. Yeah, so now that we've seen a few of those case studies, it's worth stepping back to look at what practitioners themselves told us, and what their challenges are that they're facing day to day. So across our research and interviews, there were four key issues that came up again and again. These challenges don't necessarily mean that programs aren't working. They're really about what it takes to keep SIBs active, visible, and effective in the very different contexts across the country. So the first one is limited staff capacity, especially in smaller programs where one or two people might be running the entire SIB alongside other responsibilities. And that naturally affects things like marketing and outreach, which is the second major issue. Many programs just don't have the resources to promote themselves or identify new borrowers. The third challenge is one that we hear most about federally backed SIBs, which is this flexibility question. And finally, competition from grants. So when there's a lot of grant money in circulation, many local sponsors understandably go through that route first. And we'll unpack each of these in more detail, but first we'll look at a word cloud that we got from the symposium, which shows that these themes were echoed by practitioners in the room. So during the symposium, we asked what challenges they faced in managing or promoting their SIBs, and this word cloud captures the responses. As you can see, outreach, marketing, staffing, and funding came up the most. And then there's other words like capitalization, red tape, executive buy-in that reflect some of the more structural and administrative hurdles that programs deal with day to day. So there was a strong alignment with what we had heard in our interviews and seen in our research with what practitioners themselves were experiencing. So let's take a look at the challenges in a little bit more detail. So the first one is the limited staff capacity. So some programs like Texas with dedicated team and active board have the resources to manage outreach, strategic planning, and process improvements all at once. But most SIBs operate with very lean teams, often a single administrator or part-time staff who manages every aspect of the program. So things from application review to marketing, reporting, committee preparations. And with that kind of capacity, staff have to make choices about what to prioritize. So the core operational needs, which is like processing applications, coordinating approvals, ensuring compliance, that naturally takes precedence over things like strategic planning, outreach, or process improvements, um, which are essential for growing the program or attracting new borrowers. This also creates risk when staff leaves. So some of the smaller SIBs told us that rebuilding continuity after a key staff departure could take months. So while larger SIBs can take a more proactive approach, smaller ones operate more reactively. So they do a lot with very little. And that trade-off affects everything from visibility to the types of projects that they can support. And that leads us again to the next issue, which is marketing and visibility. Um, so um, in many cases, marketing is limited to answering inquiries as they come in rather than actively cultivating new leads. Some programs do get creative, right? So one SIP told us that they use district DOT offices to serve as local points of contact, um, and that helps maintain responsiveness even with limited staff. But overall, this is a lead-driven business, and if you're not generating new leads, the loan activity naturally slows down. So the most successful programs really treat marketing as a continuous effort, not a one-time campaign. They maintain relationships with MPOs, counties, uh, local agencies, federal agencies, to stay on top of mind when projects arise. And then smaller SIBs, in contrast, often operate reactively, which limits their ability to attract new borrowers or expand beyond a handful of like repeat clients. Something we saw a lot is that like once someone gets a SIB loan, they're much more likely to come back to the SIB. Um, yeah, but that requires getting new borrowers. So we talked about the challenges, but we heard that SIBs don't just need new marketing and materials. When SIBs talk about marketing, they also uh, what they're looking for is market intelligence as well. So tools or data to identify where SIB financing can make a difference before projects are fully formed. That means understanding where funding gaps exist and positioning the SIB as part of that financing solution early on, not as an afterthought after all the grants have been used up. So visibility isn't just about like exposure, it's about strategy, it's about knowing the market, it's about anticipating needs and connecting with the right partners at the right time. And again, in part, that's why you all are here. It's so that you can have SIBs at the top of your mind whenever you see a situation that might benefit from a SIB loan. Um, all right, so the next challenge, which is a more technical challenge, is the SIBs face federal requirements tied to their federally capitalized accounts. So again, these accounts are governed by Titles 23 and 49, and these titles like ensure transparency and accountability, but they also add administrative steps that can make them less flexible for some projects. So because of this, many SIBs have learned to be strategic. Rather than seeing these requirements as barriers, they've developed ways to balance activity between their state and federal accounts. So this chart is a good example of how that balance works in practice. So both of these are hybrid SIBs, and it shows how much more frequently they use state accounts compared to federal ones. State accounts are more flexible, and it allows SIBs to support a wider range of projects without the same compliance burden. But the federal accounts remain an important resource reserved for projects that already meet those federal requirements and allow them to use federal funds instead of having to turn to the state funds. And what's interesting here is that by maintaining kind of that steady baseload loan activity through their state accounts, SIBs keep their teams engaged, keep that capacity and that institutional knowledge, even when federal lending slows. And it naturally slows because there's just fewer projects out there that meet these titles 23 and 49 provisions. Um, so they manage to maintain that capacity through their state accounts. And then when the right opportunity comes along, when a project that's fully eligible, they have the staff and the systems ready to act quickly. So rather than viewing this as a constraint, many SIBs see it as a way to stay flexible. So they use the state funds to stay active and the federal funds when that aligns naturally with the project pipeline. And then finally, it's important to recognize that SIBs operate in different funding environments across states, and that context shapes their activity. So in some states, particularly those with grant-rich environments, there's simply more non-repayable funding available. In those cases, project sponsors are understandably more likely to turn to grants before considering loans, especially when there's large federal or state programs that offer generous support. That doesn't mean that SIBs aren't useful in those settings. It just means that they play a more targeted role. Because SIBs offer rolling application cycles, they can provide financing between grant windows, or when a project doesn't quite fit within a specific grant program, they can also help bridge gaps, bridge cash flow gaps or timing gaps. And then the reporting requirements can also be less onerous than federal grants or state grants, especially for smaller local sponsors. So they can still fill that gap. And so that's something that we'll be coming back to, like that filling that gap is something that SIBs are really naturally inclined to do. And then on the flip side, in states with fewer grant opportunities, SIBs often play a much larger role. So there has been cases where SIBs finance the whole project. We don't see that often, but it does happen. But in any case, in those environments, SIBs become an important funding partner, and they support a broad mix of projects. So while the balance looks different from state to state, the underlying idea is the same. SIBs adapt to their environment and fill the gaps with grants fill the gaps that grants and other programs cannot. So as we've seen, the context for SIBs can vary a lot from staff and resource capacity to the funding environment, but despite that variation, there are common traits that make certain programs consistently stronger and more effective. So I'll turn now to Christian to walk us through some of those drivers of success, the things that practitioners themselves have said make SIBs work.
Thank you, Thomas. As Thomas mentioned, we engaged a symposium earlier in the year and asked their opinions about what the market finds most useful about SIBs. And I think practitioners describe SIBs in many ways. We've mentioned already the idea of flexible financing tools, trusted partner was often a term used, reliable sources of project support. And I think to Thomas's point, the range of responses underscores that there's no single vision of what SIB success looks like. It's kind of tailored to how the program is initially capitalized and how that drives where they provide energy and really kind of start building momentum in certain kind of categories of projects. Everything here you can see this word cloud. The more responses received, you see, larger font. But there were also just terms used about, providing alternatives, addressing, offerings of low interest rates and freedom. But I think we did identify some commonalities that we'll explore in the next slides, that really we saw as kind of recurring themes that really contribute and drive strong SIB programs, and enhance their offering within the transportation space. And I think what's important to bear in mind as we go through these quote unquote success drivers is that they vary at scale. So some of them are oriented toward the more programmatic level. Some of them are day-to-day operational and state by state level. So I think you as a transportation professional, it's worth thinking about where your engagement might lie. So at what tier it might lie and where you might interact with some of these success drivers for SIBs potentially. The first, I think, is not rocket science, but still important to note that having dedicated, knowledgeable staff helps a SIB thrive. But I think what's important to key in here is that running a SIB requires continuous engagement with potential applicants. It also requires financial oversight. It requires coordination of partners. If you are a professional within a SIB program, you're required to prepare the briefing packet for the loan application committee or the credit committee, whatever that might be. And then once the application is deemed appropriate, you are then responsible for managing the loan case and making sure that that loan is timeous and the reporting is conducted and the loan is closed out properly. All of these different elements are part of your job description. And therefore, when you don't have dedicated staff, i.e. when staff sit with multiple portfolios, it can be challenging to run SIBs effectively. So having a knowledgeable person who has the space to dedicate to the management of SIB and the operation of the SIB and handling the portfolio of loans is a pretty critical driver of success for SIBs. Another, I think, driver is that we found in our research and in our engagement that the most effective SIBs are the ones people remember at the start of funding conversations. And how do you do that? You do that by being visible. And visibility only comes from proactive outreach, from being at part of planning discussions, being at the right conference events, meeting with local agencies, and sharing success stories. So that often has to be weighed against, if you're only one person or one or two people, how do you identify the right venues to be at, to generate leads? And that goes to Thomas's point about a number of SIBs struggling with the market intelligence element of this. So how do they get more precise in the utilization of the limited time that they can offer? I think for this audience, it's worth considering how your own organization can help amplify the visibility of SIBs or SIB programs, whether that's by connecting local projects to SIB administrators or spreading awareness generally of this financing option. I think the third thing that we discovered is that there's a lot of utility in having hybrid SIBs, which combine the federal and state accounts so that you can divert effort into areas of your portfolio that are more active at different times than others. So as kind of major federally eligible projects slow, your state account allows kind of different scale or different type of projects to continue, the overall SIB program to continue lending, look at internal processes. How do you refine standard operating procedures? How do you find those optimization opportunities? How do you maintain and encourage staff to grow in their professional experience? I think this flexibility not only sustains momentum, but generally strengthens institutional capability when those federal opportunities arise. And it's a reminder for the audience that even small scale projects, not just large scale federally oriented projects, can be brought to many SIBs and are worth seeking support on. I think one of the clearest insights from our research is that SIBs really deliver their greatest value when they lean into and fully embrace their role as flexible catalytic finance tools. They're filling funding gaps and accelerating project delivery, as Thomas mentioned, that rather than competing with grants, strong programs position SIB lending as a bridge that helps projects advance when other funding sources fall short or arrive too slowly. And the availability of revolving SIB funds allow agencies to move projects forward sooner, maintain delivery schedules, and captures efficiencies, which would otherwise be lost waiting for new appropriations or grant cycles. Leaning into this niche, providing that gap coverage, providing that timing flexibility, and delivering or supporting delivery acceleration, SIBs really are a complementary tool within the overall transportation investment ecosystem and make every federal and state dollar go a bit further. I think the final thing that we would note, and to encourage any existing SIB practitioners in the room, but also just note as far as any of those who are interested in the institutional elements of this, is it's quite obvious, as any bank could tell you, make your application processes simple. So our research found that SIBs that had spent a good bit of time working on their application review and approvals process, integrating their IT systems with their online application portals to their application, not just application, but loan case management systems, and finding those synergies have resulted in better throughput of total loans. Clear process, transparent criteria, and responsive communication, I think, build confidence among local sponsors and turn initial applicants into repeat borrowers. And from an operational standpoint, focusing on how do we stage gate applications, how do we ask for the right information at the right time, allow you to manage a better volume, but also direct effort to where it makes the most sense, and expand the footprint of your SIB portfolio. In summary, I think what we have determined, or what our research helps support and validate, is that SIBs continue to be a very active and useful tool. Across the country, they've proven to be helpful and flexible, supporting a wide range of transportation projects and sponsors. I think that this strength endures largely through dedicated staff, really leaning into that flexibility element, and making sure that portfolios are managed with sound stewardship. I think the Build America Center continues to stand as a resource to help states and practitioners share knowledge, build capacity, and expand SIB success. And as a final word, we think your role counts in supporting and providing awareness and engaging transportation professionals to expand the reach and impact of these SIB programs. We thank you for the opportunity to present to you. We hope you found some of this input useful, and we stand ready for any questions you might have. I think a brief word from Mike before we jump off into questions.
Yeah, so Thomas and Christian, thanks very much for the presentation. So just want to point out to folks that are with us a couple of things that we posted in the chat. First, I posted a link to the report that the Build America Center published back in May that was completed by Rebel that summarizes all the work they've done about state infrastructure banks. My colleague QC also posted a link to the SIB symposium that Christian and Thomas referenced, and so there are some highlights and takeaways there. So those resources are in the chat, and you can access that information off the Build America Center's website. So a couple of questions that came up during the presentation, and I encourage anyone that's got additional questions to please post them in the chat. One question goes back fairly technical, but it's that the question is like, so if you have interest earned on a hybrid SIB, would it be required to meet federal requirements, or would it be eligible for less restrictive use?
So, I think I'll take this question. It depends on which account you're using. So if you're using the state account, then that doesn't have any federal requirements, and the money that comes back to the fund stays as a state account, so it doesn't have those federal requirements. Now, for the federal account, what happened is that during the pilot project, the money that would come back as interest and principal would no longer have that federal requirement. So, and the pilot SIBs that are still operating today, they still have that. So they've kind of used up all of their federal required money in a way, and now it's still in a federal account, but it doesn't have those federal requirements. Now, if you were to set up a new federal account, the recycled money would still have those federal requirements. Yeah, so there's three answers to that in a way.
Okay. Another question. So is a SIB loan can be used as a match for a federal match, but you cannot pay the SIB loan back with federal funds.
Yeah, and so I'll take this as well. I was reviewing the legislation, so the section 610 of Title 23, and it doesn't say where the repayment money has to come from. So I think it doesn't say that federal funds cannot be used to pay a SIB loan back. But I'm no lawyer, so I'm not 100% sure. But I don't think it says anywhere where that money has to come from. And there's different sources that are used. So we talked about like sales taxes and license taxes and things like that, but it doesn't say anywhere that you can't use federal money to pay the SIB loans back. And another thing that we've seen as well is that during the pandemic, when interest rates were pretty low, there were early repayments of these SIB loans. And so SIBs actually had a lot of cash on hand that they've started to draw on a little bit more quickly after the pandemic, essentially. But yeah, so like if if an MPO or a county finds a federal fund that they can use to pay back the SIB loan, I don't think that there's anything preventing them from doing that.
Okay, another question was asked, and I think this is probably covered in the report that you guys put together, but does that report have a listing of the states and the types of SIBs that they operate?
So the report has a listing of all of the federal the all of the SIBs that have federal capitalization. So it any all of again, we didn't really do much work on outreach to just state-backed SIBs, in part because they don't fit super well under the transportation or transit umbrella necessarily. Like there are some state revolving banks that work on different types of projects, so like energy or water. So I think the New Jersey State Infrastructure Bank kind of fits all of that under one umbrella, whereas we were focused more on the federal side and also on the transit and transportation side of things. So we do have a list of the federally backed SIBs, not so much of the state backed SIBs.
Okay. Thanks, Thomas. Another question just popped in. So if a state does not have a SIB, state or federal, but has developed loan programs within multiple departments, is there an example of where a state has pulled these programs into a state SIB or a hybrid, and would it provide a benefit to consolidate these programs?
Um, I'm not sure about this. Again, this relates to the state side of things. I think because for the federal accounts, like there's a pretty established capitalization process, right? Like use federal money, you match it with state money, that creates a federal account, and that has these stipulations and these uses. Um, but states themselves can be more flexible with their own money and their own kind of account. So I'm not sure what this history behind each of these state SIBs has been. Um, yeah.
And I might be able to just chime in here, and it's purely anecdotal evidence, but I think we know of at least two where there were a number of disparate state-oriented infrastructure loan accounts that have since started to move toward a consolidated infrastructure bank at the state level, and then the federal loan accounts or the federally backed transportation loan accounts getting housed within that. So I think people are trending toward consolidation of at least the personnel and the kind of lending infrastructure, so to speak. Uh, so that I would read as a benefit to consolidation. But again, this is somewhat anecdotal and not necessarily approached with any robust methodology of analysis.
Okay. Thanks, Christian. So another question, what are other loan options for agencies where, let's say, the state's SIB maximum loan amounts are small?
Tifia and Riff. Yeah. Again, it depends by states. So we talked to some states where it was a grant-rich environment, so that they didn't feel the need to even issue these kinds of SIB loans. And then there's some states where the SIB has crazy capitalization, and so they can take on really any project they need to. Um, but yeah, so I think if the loan becomes large, the need for a loan becomes large enough, then turning to yeah, Tiffy and Riff, I guess.
Okay. Any other questions? Let's see here.
Garvey,
Yeah,
yes.
QC pointed out Garvey. That's a good point. Yeah, you can certainly probably look at Garvey bonds.
Yeah.
Any other questions that anybody might have before we wrap things up? All right. Well, so one thing popped in here. In a P3 project, can a
Yes.
private entity receive SIB loans?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
the question is yes. All right. So I think we'll end on that.